Ah, welcome back, you beautiful contradiction. You paradox in motion. You calm storm. You quiet mind. They tried to confuse and somehow couldn't. They thought they had you figured out. They thought you were predictable, soft-hearted, loyal, forgiving, a little too patient for your own good. They saw your kindness and mistook it for an opening. They saw your empathy and labeled it leverage. They saw your silence and assumed it was surrender. So they prepared the bait, not literal bait. Number promises, praise guilt. Subtle comparisons, manufactured urgency, carefully timed affection followed by withdrawal. They dangled validation in front of you. They wrapped control in concern. They disguised pressure as love, and they waited. They expected you to bite the way you used to defend yourself, to over-explain, to prove your innocence, to chase clarity like oxygen, because that was the pattern. That was the game. Push, confuse, withdraw, reward, repeat. They believed if they pulled the right emotional string, you would dance. If they applied the right guilt, you would fold. If they questioned your reality long enough, you would begin to doubt your own memory. But something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, not in a way they could screenshot or post about. It shifted quietly inside you. The first time you didn't react the way they predicted. They told themselves it was a fluke. The second time, they grew curious. The third time, they grew uneasy. Because you weren't biting anymore. You were watching. You were observing the mechanics. You noticed how the concern only appeared when you pulled away. How the misunderstandings always benefited them. How the accidents always placed you in a position to apologize for something you didn't do. You began to see the hook behind the compliment, the trap inside the invitation, the pressure hidden inside the praise. And instead of snapping back or shutting down, you did something far more destabilizing. You paused, you listened, you studied, you became still. They mistook that stillness for confusion. It wasn't confusion, it was calibration. You were mapping patterns, cataloging timing, noting tone shifts, recognizing how their words changed depending on who was watching. You weren't reacting impulsively anymore. You were learning. And that's when the power dynamic began to fracture. Because manipulation relies on movement. It needs your emotion, your urgency, your defensiveness, your need to fix things. It cannot function in silence. It cannot breathe in calm. And you, beautiful contradiction, became calm. You stopped rushing to clarify yourself. You stopped fighting to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped explaining boundaries that were already clear. You let the bait hang in the air. You let the hook sit untouched. You let the trap expose itself. And do you know what happens to a trap that never gets triggered? It reveals the person who set it. They began showing more than they intended. Frustration slipped through their tone. Control leaked through their advice. Their urgency became visible. Their dependence on your reaction became obvious. The more you didn't respond, the more they escalated. Not violently, not dramatically, but strategically. They repeated themselves. They intensified praise. They increased guilt. They introduced subtle fear. Because they needed you hooked, and when you didn't bite, their system began to collapse. Not publicly, internally. You saw it in their eyes, that flicker of recalculation. The moment they realized you were no longer playing, and that realization unsettled them more than any confrontation ever could. You didn't attack, you didn't expose them, you didn't humiliate them. You simply withdrew participation. You stopped feeding the dynamic. And here's the part they will never admit out loud. That non-reaction terrified them. Because they couldn't control it. They couldn't provoke it. They couldn't predict it. They had built their influence on your responsiveness, on your need to maintain harmony, on your habit of smoothing things over. But now you weren't smoothing. You weren't fixing. You weren't negotiating your own boundaries to keep the peace. You were standing still, and stillness, when rooted in clarity, is untouchable. They tried one more hook, one more carefully worded attempt to pull you back into the loop, and you saw it immediately. The tone, the timing, the emotional pressure hidden beneath casual phrasing. Old you might have reacted, old you might have defended, old you might have overthought it for days. But this version of you, this version simply nodded internally and stepped aside. You let the line fall to the floor. You didn't cut it angrily. You didn't snap. You just refused it. That refusal did something extraordinary. It forced them to face themselves. Because without your reaction, their tactic had nowhere to land. Without your guilt, their leverage dissolved. Without your fear, their authority shrank. You didn't dominate them. You disarmed the game. And that's the difference. Domination seeks control. Clarity removes the need for it. You didn't win. You graduated. You outgrew the board entirely. While they were still adjusting pieces, you had stepped into a different arena, an internal one, where your worth wasn't negotiated, where your boundaries weren't up for debate, where your peace wasn't currency. They underestimated that evolution. They thought you were still hungry for their approval, still craving validation, still chasing resolution. But you weren't hungry anymore. You were aware. Awareness changes everything. When you understand the pattern loses power. When you recognize the hook, it can't pierce you. When you see the trap before stepping in, you don't need to escape it. You simply walk around it. And here's the quiet truth that unsettles them the most. You're not angry. You're not plotting. You're not carrying resentment like a badge. You're simply done. Done reacting. Done proving. Done defending. Done needing to be understood by someone who profits from your confusion. That calm is what destabilized the entire structure. Because emotional games rely on emotional volatility, and you are no longer volatile. You are measured. You are observant. You are unhookable. And in becoming unhookable, you became something they didn't anticipate. A mirror, not a hostile one, not an accusing one, just a clear one. Their tactics reflect back to them now. Their urgency looks obvious. Their strategies look repetitive. Their subtle manipulations feel transparent. And they know you see it. That awareness sits between you like unspoken truth. They feel it in the pauses, in the space between sentences. In the way you don't rush to respond anymore. You didn't destroy their system. You simply stopped believing in it. And systems built on illusion crumble the moment belief is withdrawn. You turned pain into perception, confusion into pattern recognition, gaslighting into emotional literacy. You didn't sell anything back with revenge. You sold it back with indifference, with clarity, with the quiet demonstration that their tactics no longer apply to you. And here's the most destabilizing part of all. You didn't need to announce it. You didn't need to explain your transformation. You didn't need a dramatic exit speech. You just shifted. And that shift continues. You're not interested in winning arguments anymore. You're interested in protecting your peace. You're not interested in exposing every tactic. You're interested in choosing environments where tactics aren't necessary. You're not interested in proving your intelligence. You're interested in preserving your energy. And the more you embody that, the less their old methods matter. Because you've stepped into something else entirely. Something quieter, something stronger, something that doesn't require dominance to feel powerful. You didn't defeat them. You became immune. And immunity spreads silently. Others are watching you now, not because you're loud, not because you're aggressive, but because you don't react the way they expect. They notice your stillness. They notice your boundaries. They notice how you don't chase. They notice how you don't argue to exhaustion anymore. And without speeches, without preaching, without confrontation, you are teaching that you can survive manipulation without becoming manipulative, teaching that you can leave games without declaring war, teaching that you can be powerful without being cruel. That is the contradiction they never prepared for. You are strong without hostility, aware without paranoia, detached without bitterness. You stepped out of the trap without setting one of your own. And now they are recalculating, wondering what changed, wondering when you became this steady, wondering how their best bait failed to move you. But you know the answer. You stopped needing what they were selling, and once you stop needing it, there's nothing left to hook. And this shift inside you, this quiet, grounded clarity, it's still unfolding, still deepening, still expanding in ways they cannot measure, because you're not just outside the trap anymore. You are outside the mindset that made the trap possible in the first place, and you're just getting started. And here's where it becomes even more interesting, because once you step outside the trap, once you truly see the mechanics, something irreversible happens. You can't unsee it. You can't go back to innocence. You can't unknow the rhythm of manipulation, the pacing of guilt, the subtle choreography of emotional pressure. But instead of becoming hardened, you became refined. That's the part no one expected. They assumed awareness would make you aggressive, that clarity would make you confrontational, that seeing through the game would turn you into someone obsessed with exposing it. But you didn't become louder, you became lighter. You stopped carrying conversations that weren't yours to fix. You stopped correcting narratives that weren't rooted in truth. You stopped volunteering for emotional labor disguised as love. And something fascinating happened. Without your participation, their patterns began collapsing under their own weight. They tried the old tones, the old timing, the familiar emotional cues, but without your reaction, those cues echoed back awkwardly, flat, powerless. You realized something profound. Manipulation is a performance that requires an audience. And you quietly left the theater, not with a dramatic exit, not slamming doors, just a soft withdrawal of attention. You stopped rewarding subtle control with emotional energy. You stopped arguing with misinterpretation. You stopped defending yourself against projections. And in doing so, you discovered something that feels almost unfair in its simplicity. The moment you stopped reacting, you started choosing when to speak, choosing when to disengage, choosing where your energy flows. That choice is freedom, not the loud kind, not the rebellious kind, the internal kind, the kind where your nervous system stays calm in conversations that once would have spiraled, the kind where silence feels safe instead of threatening, the kind where you can see the hook and simply smile, not because you're superior, but because you're no longer susceptible. You don't need to dismantle anyone anymore. You don't need to prove you understand the pattern. You don't need to win. You just recognize, and recognition is enough, because when you recognize the dynamic, you no longer personalize it. You no longer internalize it. You no longer twist yourself trying to fit into someone else's narrative. You let them keep their story. You keep your peace. And that's the quiet revolution. You didn't conquer the system, you transcended it. You didn't dominate the players, you withdrew from the board. And now, when someone attempts the old tactics, subtle guilt, strategic praise, emotional ambiguity, you feel it immediately, not as panic, not as confusion. Just as information, you process it. You adjust. You move accordingly. No drama, no internal storm. Just clarity, and clarity, once embodied, is almost impossible to destabilize. They can't hook someone who isn't reaching. They can't confuse someone who trusts their perception. They can't pressure someone who isn't afraid of walking away. You didn't become untouchable because you hardened. You became untouchable because you understood. And understanding doesn't scream. It doesn't posture. It doesn't seek revenge. It simply stands still while the chaos exhausts itself. You are no longer reacting to the bait. You are observing the fisherman, and once you see the whole shoreline clearly, you don't need to swim in those waters anymore. You choose where you place your energy now. You choose who gets access. You choose what patterns you entertain. And that choice, that calm, grounded, deliberate choice, is still evolving, still expanding, still anchoring you deeper into a version of yourself that cannot be easily shaken. Because you didn't just escape the trap, you outgrew the need to ever step near it again. And that evolution, it's still unfolding.